After spending years away working on business ventures, I finally returned to the vast 50-acre plot of land my grandfather left me, a peaceful, untouched stretch of property that was supposed to be my future investment. But as I drove up the familiar dirt road, something was wrong. The old wooden fence that once marked the boundary was gone, replaced by a pristine white HOA-approved barrier. Confused, I kept driving, expecting to see the quiet expanse of trees and open fields I had known all my life. Instead, I was met with rows upon rows of identical cookie-cutter houses, each with neatly trimmed lawns and spotless sidewalks. A massive, gleaming sign at the entrance read Willow Creek Estates, a premier HOA community. My stomach twisted as I realized what I was looking at. An entire neighborhood had been built on my land, and I had never sold a single acre. Dazed, I parked near the community clubhouse, stepping out into a surreal world that shouldn't have existed. Residents walked their dogs, children played in driveways, and HOA-mandated landscaping crews trimmed bushes as if everything was normal. But this was far from normal. I owned this land, and somehow these people had built a whole community on it. I walked up to one of the neatly paved roads, trying to understand what had happened. That's when a well-dressed man with a clipboard and an air of self-importance approached me. "Excuse me, sir," he said with a condescending smile. "This is private property, and we don't allow solicitors." I nearly laughed at the absurdity. This was my property. I asked him who he was, and he proudly introduced himself as Greg Thompson, the president of the Willow Creek HOA. I told him I owned this land, expecting shock or at least some kind of concern. Instead, he chuckled and shook his head. "That's impossible. This land was developed years ago, all legally purchased and properly filed." My blood ran cold. Had they somehow stolen my property through legal loopholes? I demanded to see records, but Greg waved me off. "If you have complaints, take it up with the county," he said before handing me a warning notice for trespassing on what he claimed was their community. The arrogance of it was staggering. Rather than causing a scene, I played along, nodding as if I would comply, but deep inside, my mind was already working. I needed to find out exactly how they had gotten away with this, and more importantly, how I was going to take it all back. Without another word, I turned on my heels and walked back to my truck, pretending to leave, but in reality, I was about to begin the greatest trap I had ever set. Sitting in my truck just outside the so-called Willow Creek Estates, I took a deep breath, forcing myself to think logically instead of acting on rage. The sheer audacity of the HOA president, Greg, telling me that I was trespassing on my own land had been a slap in the face, but I knew one thing for sure: if this was some kind of fraud, there had to be a paper trail. People don't just take 50 acres of private land and build a whole neighborhood on it without leaving behind a mess of legal documents, permits, and transactions. The trick was finding them. That night, I went home and dug up every piece of documentation my grandfather had ever left me. Deeds, tax records, surveyor maps, it was all there. My name was still on everything. That meant I legally still owned this land, and if these people had built on it, they had done so illegally or through some kind of deception. But I needed more. Early the next morning, I drove straight to the county recorder's office, marching up to the records clerk with a polite but firm request for any recent transfers, developments, or sales involving my property. At first, the clerk gave me the usual bureaucratic runaround, saying I needed to fill out forms, wait for processing, or come back another day. But when I mentioned that I was the legal owner and that I believed my land had been unlawfully taken, his attitude shifted. He hesitated before saying, "Wait here." Minutes later, he came back with a thick file. My stomach tightened as I flipped through the documents. What I saw made my blood boil. The land had never been officially sold. Instead, a shady real estate developer had somehow filed fraudulent paperwork claiming that the land was abandoned and unclaimed before transferring it to a shell corporation that eventually sold it off to the developers who built Willow Creek Estates. The signatures on the transfer documents were forgeries, and the notary's stamp looked suspicious at best. But that wasn't even the worst part. As I read further, I realized that the HOA itself was complicit. The documents showed that Greg Thompson, the smug HOA president, had been involved with the development from the start. He had pushed the county board to approve zoning changes, expedited permits through questionable means, and even signed off on the final paperwork transferring control of the land to the HOA before homes were even built. It wasn't just fraud, it was a calculated land grab. I clenched my fists, barely containing my fury. They thought I had disappeared, that no one would come back to claim the land, that they could sweep their crime under the rug and profit off of my inheritance. But they had made one fatal mistake: they thought I was powerless. I wasn't going to storm into Greg's office and start yelling. That would tip my hand too early. No, I needed to be smarter than that. I needed to lay my own trap, just like they had done to me. My next stop was a lawyer's office, a very specific kind of lawyer. I needed someone ruthless, someone who had dealt with real estate fraud before and knew how to take entire corporations apart piece by piece. I spent hours explaining every detail to him, showing the documents, pointing out the fraud, the corruption, and the outright theft of my land. When I was done, he leaned back in his chair, smirking slightly. "This isn't just a lawsuit," he said. "This is a war. And trust me, you're going to win." That was exactly what I wanted to hear. Because now, I wasn't just going to take my land back, I was going to make them regret ever thinking they could steal from me. Sitting across from my lawyer, a sharp-eyed, no-nonsense professional named Mark Holloway. I laid out every piece of evidence I had uncovered. The forged documents, the fraudulent land transfer, the HOA's shady involvement, it was all there, a tangled web of corruption and deceit. Mark listened intently, occasionally nodding as he flipped through the paperwork, his expression growing more serious with each passing minute. When he finally set the documents down, he let out a slow breath and gave me a knowing smirk. "They screwed up," he said. "Big time. But that didn't mean we could just march into court and expect an instant win." Mark explained that while the fraud was clear, we needed to make our case airtight before bringing it forward. A rushed lawsuit could lead to delays, appeals, or, worst-case scenario, a loophole that let the HOA wriggle out of trouble. If we go in swinging without a plan, he warned, we give them time to cover their tracks. We need to hit them when they least expect it and when they're at their most vulnerable. That's when the real strategy began. Instead of filing an immediate lawsuit, we decided to let them dig their own grave first. I would act like I had given up, like I was just another guy who had been brushed aside by the system. Meanwhile, Mark would quietly begin the legal process behind the scenes, securing temporary injunctions to freeze any further land transactions involving my property. That meant the HOA couldn't sell, mortgage, or move assets around without triggering red flags in the legal system. At the same time, we hired a forensic document expert to analyze the fraudulent signatures and notary stamps on the land transfer documents. If we could prove forgery, the entire development could be declared illegally built, meaning those 96 homes would legally have no right to exist. But that wasn't all. I needed inside information, someone who could tell me what was really happening behind closed doors in the HOA. So I did something unexpected. I pretended to be interested in buying a house in Willow Creek Estates. Dressed in casual business attire, I scheduled a meeting with one of the real estate agents selling properties in the neighborhood. The agent, a chipper woman named Linda, walked me through one of the model homes, excitedly showing off the state-of-the-art amenities and strong HOA leadership that kept the community in top shape. As she talked, I casually asked about the history of the neighborhood. "Oh, it's been such a great success," she gushed. The HOA worked directly with the developers to make sure everything was legally sound from the very beginning. I fought the urge to laugh. Instead, I played dumb. "That's interesting," I said. "So, the land was always owned by the developers?" Linda hesitated for just a fraction of a second before nodding. "Well, there were some complicated legal steps, but yes. Everything was above board." That hesitation was golden. It meant that even within the real estate circles, people knew something was off. Over the next few weeks, I attended HOA meetings, posing as a potential buyer interested in moving in. I listened as Greg Thompson, the arrogant HOA president, boasted about how the community had grown, how property values had skyrocketed, and how the HOA had complete legal control over the land. He had no idea that every word he said was fueling my case against him. But the best part? I wasn't just gathering information, I was setting the perfect public trap. Because once everything was in place, I was going to expose his entire scam in the most humiliating way possible. Right in front of the very people who trusted him the most. For weeks, I played my role perfectly, just another curious homebuyer, attending HOA meetings, casually asking questions, blending into the background. The HOA board had no idea that every smug comment, every self-congratulatory speech, and every dismissive statement they made about their so-called legal authority over the land was fueling my case against them. I had gathered more than enough evidence of their fraudulent activities, but what I didn't expect was just how deep their arrogance ran. These people had spent so long operating without consequences that they genuinely believed they were untouchable. And that belief was about to destroy them. One evening, I attended an HOA town hall under the pretense of wanting to fully understand their policies before purchasing a home. The meeting room inside the community clubhouse was packed with homeowners, many of whom seemed anxious and frustrated. I quickly learned why. The HOA had just introduced a new set of fines and restrictions. Monthly HOA fees were being increased, parking rules had tightened. and residents were now required to pay out of pocket for any minor exterior home repairs deemed necessary by the board. As I listened, I noticed a pattern. Every rule and fine funneled money directly back to the HOA leadership. Greg Thompson, the HOA president, sat at the head of the table with a smug look on his face, fielding complaints with a casual arrogance that made my blood boil. A middle-aged homeowner named Mr. Dawson stood up, his face red with frustration. "How is this legal?" he demanded. "We already pay a fortune in fees, and now you're telling us we have to pay for repairs that the HOA is supposed to handle?" Greg leaned forward, lacing his fingers together. "Mr. Dawson," he said smoothly, "when you purchased a home in Willow Creek Estates, you agreed to abide by HOA regulations. We have every legal right to adjust policies as necessary." That's when I saw my opportunity. Raising my hand, I put on my best concerned homebuyer face. "Excuse me, Mr. Thompson," I said politely, "I'm really interested in moving here, but I want to understand something. You're saying that the HOA can change the rules at any time, even after someone buys a home?" Greg chuckled as if explaining something to a clueless child. "Of course. The HOA has full legal authority over this community. That's how these things work." I nodded slowly. "And the land? The land under the homes, who owns that?" Greg gave me a condescending smile. "The HOA controls all common areas and holds jurisdiction over the entire neighborhood. That's why we enforce our rules so strictly." Bingo. He had just publicly admitted that the HOA claimed ownership over land that I legally still owned. And he had done it in front of dozens of homeowners. I sat back in my chair, satisfied, while Greg continued talking, completely unaware of the bombshell he had just dropped. But things got even better when, a few days later, I intentionally let myself get caught violating HOA rules. I parked my truck slightly off the curb near the clubhouse, not blocking anything, not causing any inconvenience, just enough to be noticeable. Within minutes, an HOA officer approached me, ticket book in hand. "Sir, this is a violation of HOA regulations. Parking outside of designated spaces is subject to a fine." I raised an eyebrow. "A fine? But I don't live here." The officer smirked. "Doesn't matter. You're on HOA-controlled property, so you have to follow our rules." I took the ticket with a knowing smile. "So, just to be clear, you're saying this land belongs to the HOA, right?" "Of course," he said, his tone dripping with arrogance. That was exactly what I needed. Because not only had the president admitted it in a recorded meeting, but now I had a written HOA citation confirming that they were illegally enforcing rules on my property. Their own ignorance had just played directly into my hands. But what happened next would be even better. Because the moment I formally challenged their authority, the HOA, drunk on power and greed, made the biggest mistake of all. They tried to threaten me into submission. The HOA had no idea what was coming. They had spent years believing they were untouchable, drunk on their own power, and convinced that no one would ever dare challenge them. But they had built their empire on my land, and every smug admission, every fraudulent document, and every ridiculous fine they had issued had only tightened the noose around their own necks. It was time to spring the trap. The first move came as a formal cease and desist letter drafted by my lawyer, Mark Holloway. It was beautifully brutal, a legal masterpiece that laid out in no uncertain terms that the HOA had zero legal claim to the land they had built on. The letter demanded an immediate halt to all HOA enforcement actions on my property, an end to all financial transactions involving the land, and a full public acknowledgement of their illegal occupation. Failure to comply would result in a lawsuit so devastating it would shatter the entire organization. The response came 48 hours later, and it was exactly what I had expected: pure arrogance. Greg Thompson, the HOA president, didn't even bother responding through a lawyer. Instead, he sent me a personal email dripping with the same smug attitude he had displayed in every HOA meeting. "Mr. Landowner, or so you claim. The Willow Creek Estates HOA operates under full legal authority, and your baseless claims hold no merit. We will not be intimidated by empty threats. If you continue to harass this community, we will be forced to take legal action against you for trespassing and defamation. Consider this your final warning. Sincerely, Greg Thompson, HOA President **. I couldn't help but laugh. He had just doubled down on the fraud, putting in writing that the HOA had full legal authority over land I legally owned. He was so confident in his untouchability that he had unknowingly handed me even more evidence to bury him. So I let him bask in his delusions for just a little while longer. Because 3 days later, the Rail bomb dropped. Mark filed the official lawsuit, and it was devastating. It wasn't just a simple claim for the return of my land, it was a full-scale legal assault designed to obliterate the HOA from the ground up. We sued for fraudulent land acquisition, proving that the transfer of my land to the HOA was based on forged documents and an illegal scheme. Unjust enrichment, the HOA had collected millions in homeowner fees on land that never belonged to them. Illegally issued fines and penalties, every citation, every violation, every dollar they had extorted from residents was based on fraudulent land ownership. Criminal conspiracy and fraud, naming not just Greg Thompson but the entire HOA board as co-defendants, ensuring that no one escaped accountability. But we weren't done. Mark had also filed for an emergency injunction which would freeze all HOA operations immediately. If approved, it would mean they could no longer collect fees, issue fines, or enforce any rules until the court determined ownership of the land. The news spread like wildfire. Within hours, homeowners in Willow Creek Estates were in a panic. The HOA had sold them a lie, making them believe their homes were safe investments when, in reality, their properties were built on illegally obtained land. Residents demanded answers. Realtors started pulling listings from the market, unwilling to sell homes in a legally disputed neighborhood. And Greg? Greg was about to have the worst day of his life. Because the very next morning he got served. I had personally made sure the lawsuit was delivered to him at the HOA headquarters right in the middle of an HOA board meeting. Witnesses later told me that when he opened the envelope and started reading, his face turned sheet white. He stammered, tried to wave it off, but as he read further, the weight of it hit him like a truck. He wasn't just facing a lawsuit. He was facing the complete and total destruction of his empire. And the best part? This was only the beginning. The HOA had no idea what was coming. They had spent years believing they were untouchable, drunk on their own power, and convinced that no one would ever dare challenge them. But they had built their empire on my land, and every smug admission, every fraudulent document, and every ridiculous fine they had issued had only tightened the noose around their own necks. It was time to spring the trap. The first move came as a formal cease and desist letter drafted by my lawyer, Mark Holloway. It was beautifully brutal, a legal masterpiece that laid out in no uncertain terms that the HOA had zero legal claim to the land they had built on. The letter demanded an immediate halt to all HOA enforcement actions on my property, an end to all financial transactions involving the land, and a full public acknowledgement of their illegal occupation. Failure to comply would result in a lawsuit so devastating it would shatter the entire organization. The response came 48 hours later, and it was exactly what I had expected: pure arrogance. Greg Thompson, the HOA president, didn't even bother responding through a lawyer. Instead, he sent me a personal email dripping with the same smug attitude he had displayed in every HOA meeting. Mr. Landowner, or so you claim. The Willow Creek Estates HOA operates under full legal authority, and your baseless claims hold no merit. We will not be intimidated by empty threats. If you continue to harass this community, we will be forced to take legal action against you for trespassing and defamation. Consider this your final warning. Sincerely, Greg Thompson, HOA President *. I couldn't help but laugh. He had just doubled down on the fraud, putting in writing that the HOA had full legal authority over land I legally owned. He was so confident in his untouchability that he had unknowingly handed me even more evidence to bury him. So I let him bask in his delusions for just a little while longer. Because 3 days later, the rail bomb dropped. Mark filed the official lawsuit, and it was devastating. It wasn't just a simple claim for the return of my land, it was a full-scale legal assault designed to obliterate the HOA from the ground up. We sued for fraudulent land acquisition, proving that the transfer of my land to the HOA was based on forged documents and an illegal scheme. Unjust enrichment, the HOA had collected millions in homeowner fees on land that never belonged to them. Illegally issued fines and penalties, every citation, every violation, every dollar they had extorted from residents was based on fraudulent land ownership. Criminal conspiracy and fraud, naming not just Greg Thompson but the entire HOA board as co-defendants, ensuring that no one escaped accountability. But we weren't done. Mark had also filed for an emergency injunction which would freeze all HOA operations immediately. If approved, it would mean they could no longer collect fees, issue fines, or enforce any rules until the court determined ownership of the land. The news spread like wildfire. Within hours, homeowners in Willow Creek Estates were in a panic. The HOA had sold them a lie, making them believe their homes were safe investments when, in reality, their properties were built on illegally obtained land. Residents demanded answers. Realtors started pulling listings from the market, unwilling to sell homes in a legally disputed neighborhood. And Greg? Greg was about to have the worst day of his life. Because the very next morning he got served. I had personally made sure the lawsuit was delivered to him at the HOA headquarters right in the middle of an HOA board meeting. Witnesses later told me that when he opened the envelope and started reading, his face turned sheet white. He stammered, tried to wave it off, but as he read further, the weight of it hit him like a truck. He wasn't just facing a lawsuit. He was facing the complete and total destruction of his empire. And the best part? This was only the beginning. The moment Greg Thompson received that lawsuit, the entire HOA went into a tailspin. Their perfect little kingdom built on lies, fraud, and arrogance was crumbling faster than they could control. But rather than admit fault, rather than take a step back and realize the legal catastrophe they had walked into, they did exactly what I expected. They doubled down. I had anticipated that Greg and his board of cronies wouldn't just surrender. They had ruled over this community for years, treating homeowners like cash cows, issuing fines at will, and raking in millions in HOA fees that had never been properly accounted for. These people had grown addicted to power, and they weren't about to give it up without a fight. The first sign of their panic came just one day after they were served. Greg sent out a mass email to every homeowner in Willow Creek Estates, twisting the situation to make it seem like I was the villain. Attention Willow Creek residents. We regret to inform you that a frivolous and baseless lawsuit has been filed against the HOA by an outside party attempting to disrupt our peaceful community. This individual falsely claims ownership over land that has legally belonged to the HOA for years. Rest assured, the HOA board is taking immediate legal action to defend our rights and protect our neighborhood. Please continue to comply with all HOA regulations as this matter will be resolved swiftly. We appreciate your support in ensuring that Willow Creek Estates remains the exceptional community that it is. Sincerely, Greg Thompson, HOA President. It was pathetic. I had actual legal documents, property records, and court filings proving that my claim wasn't frivolous at all. The HOA had been caught red-handed, yet Greg was still trying to manipulate homeowners into supporting him. But his plan backfired spectacularly. Homeowners were furious. The email had the exact opposite effect he intended. Residents started talking, asking dangerous questions. If my lawsuit had no merit, why was it in court? Why had they never seen the land ownership documents the HOA claimed to have? And most importantly, if I did own the land, what did that mean for their homes? The HOA board scrambled to control the narrative. They started issuing ridiculous fines left and right, punishing residents for trivial infractions like leaving garbage cans out a few minutes too long or having unauthorized holiday decorations. It was pure desperation. They needed money fast to fight my lawsuit, so they resorted to their favorite tactic, financial intimidation. But that's when things got ugly. One homeowner, a retired veteran named Carl Matthews, had been living in the neighborhood for over a decade. When he got hit with a sudden $2,500 compliance fine, he snapped. He marched straight into the HOA office, demanding answers. But instead of being met with an explanation, he was threatened. Greg himself told Carl that if he didn't pay up, the HOA would put a lien on his home and start foreclosure proceedings. That was the final straw. Carl went straight to the local news. The very next evening, a primetime news report aired exposing the HOA's corruption. The story painted a brutal picture, a fraudulent HOA illegally occupying land, extorting homeowners, and now facing a massive lawsuit that could dismantle it entirely. They even featured my case, explaining in detail how the HOA had built 96 homes on land that never legally belonged to them. That broadcast was the beginning of the end. By the next morning, my phone was blowing up. News stations wanted interviews. Homeowners wanted to join my lawsuit. Even local politicians started weighing in, calling for an investigation into the HOA's finances. The once mighty Willow Creek Estates HOA was now a public scandal. But Greg? He still refused to back down. Instead, he escalated. In a last-ditch effort to intimidate me, he sent me a cease and desist letter from an HOA-affiliated attorney, threatening me with defamation charges if I didn't withdraw my lawsuit immediately. I nearly laughed out loud when I read it. Because Greg had no idea that his attorney had just walked into my trap. The next move wasn't just mine, it was the court's. And what happened next sealed the HOA's fate forever. Greg Thompson had been playing a losing game from the start, but he didn't realize it until it was far too late. His desperate email campaign to homeowners had backfired. His attempt to intimidate me with a laughable cease and desist letter had only made things worse. And now? The lawsuit wasn't just a private legal battle anymore, it had captured national attention. The moment the local news aired the story exposing how the HOA had fraudulently built 96 homes on land that never legally belonged to them, the pressure became unbearable. Homeowners started banding together, realizing they had been duped by the very organization that claimed to protect their community. Even worse, state regulators were now involved. 2 days after the news broke, a judge finally ruled on my emergency injunction request. And the verdict was devastating for the HOA. The court freezes the HOA's power. The ruling came down at 9 a.m. sharp. The courtroom was packed with homeowners, HOA board members, and several journalists eager to see how this would unfold. My lawyer, Mark Holloway, sat beside me, perfectly composed, knowing we had them cornered. Greg and his team of overpaid lawyers strutted in like they still had control over the situation. But the moment the judge walked in, all their confidence evaporated. After reviewing the evidence presented, including land ownership documents, financial records, and claims of fraudulent activity, the court finds sufficient grounds to grant an emergency injunction against the Willow Creek Estates HOA. That one sentence changed everything. The judge continued, laying out the harshest restrictions possible. All HOA enforcement actions were suspended immediately. No more fines, no more penalties, no more harassment of homeowners. All HOA financial accounts were frozen pending a full audit. No more HOA fees could be collected. All pending foreclosures initiated by the HOA were halted. The court would appoint a forensic auditor to investigate the HOA's financial records and determine if criminal activity had taken place. The moment those words left the judge's mouth, Greg's face turned redder than a fire truck. The man tried to protest, stammering about how this would cripple the HOA and cause irreparable harm to the community. But the judge wasn't having it. Mr. Thompson, the irreparable harm has already been done by you and your organization. You built an entire community on land you had no legal right to. And now you will answer for that. The courtroom erupted. Homeowners were whispering, some even cheering under their breath. The HOA's iron grip on Willow Creek Estates had just been shattered in an instant. But that was just the beginning. The HOA's financial fraud is exposed. The forensic auditor got to work immediately, tearing through years of financial records, uncovering one scandal after another. Within days, the truth came spilling out. Millions of dollars in HOA fees were completely unaccounted for. Fake invoices were found where money had supposedly been spent on community improvements that never actually happened. Greg and other board members had been funneling money into personal accounts, paying themselves outrageous consulting fees for work they never did. And worst of all, the HOA had lied about their legal ownership of the land from the very beginning, knowingly collecting money on a foundation of fraud. The findings were so damning that the state attorney general got involved. By the time the next court hearing arrived, Greg wasn't just fighting me, he was now facing criminal charges. The HOA's defense completely crumbled. Greg's own lawyers abandoned him, realizing they couldn't win. And when the judge finally issued his ruling, the HOA is officially dismantled. The judge delivered the final blow with a ruling that completely dissolved the Willow Creek Estates HOA. This organization has engaged in systematic fraud, financial mismanagement, and illegal land occupation. As such, it no longer has the legal right to operate. Effective immediately, the Willow Creek Estates HOA is hereby disbanded. The courtroom exploded into chaos. Some homeowners cheered so loudly that the bailiff had to call for order. Others were in shock, realizing their lives had just been turned upside down. And Greg? He looked completely broken. He had spent years building his little kingdom, convinced he was untouchable. But now? The power he had clung to so desperately was gone in an instant. But it wasn't over yet. Because now I was coming for everything they had taken from me. The final chapter of the HOA's downfall wasn't just about the legal victory, it was about making sure they were held accountable in every possible way. Dismantling the HOA was just the beginning. My goal was always clear, to ensure they paid for the damage they caused, to return the land to its rightful owner, and to provide homeowners with the peace and security they deserved. I wasn't interested in just winning the lawsuit, I was focused on making sure that justice was served in every form it could take. Reclaiming the land and restoring ownership. The first step in my ultimate victory was regaining control over my land. As the court had ruled, the HOA no longer had any claim to the property they had illegally built on. It was mine, and now it was time to make sure no one else could profit off it ever again. The moment the judge handed down the final ruling that disbanded the HOA, the land was immediately returned to me. The legal battle had been long, but every step of it had led to this moment of triumph. I went from being a landowner threatened with having my property stolen to the rightful owner of not just my land but the very future of Willow Creek Estates. But I wasn't going to just keep the land for myself. My goal had always been about righting the wrongs done to the people of Willow Creek. I had spent years watching how the HOA had exploited homeowners, and now it was time to offer them the chance to move forward in peace. I met with a local developer, someone I knew had a reputation for ethical business practices, and struck a deal to redevelop the entire area into a more affordable, homeowner-friendly community. The homes in the new era of Willow Creek Estates. The first step was clearing up the mess the HOA had left behind. The homes the HOA had built were not up to code, and many had been constructed with shoddy materials. I worked with contractors to renovate the homes, ensuring they were brought up to modern standards. Next, I made sure that every homeowner who had been affected by the HOA's fraud received compensation. I set up a fund to help them recover some of the fees they had paid over the years, money they had been forced to pay to an illegal entity. The fund wasn't huge, but it was a way to show that justice had been restored and that they weren't alone in their fight. In a very public ceremony, I invited the residents of Willow Creek Estates to a community meeting where I announced the new direction the neighborhood would take. The HOA was gone forever, and in its place, I was introducing a new form of management, one that would be community-driven and focused on the well-being of the homeowners. No longer would a group of self-serving individuals have the power to dictate how people lived. I established a community board, elected by the homeowners, and gave them the power to make decisions about the neighborhood's rules and regulations. The new system was simple but effective. Residents could propose changes, vote on them, and have a real say in how things were run. A new era of accountability. While my work with the community was just getting started, I made sure that the HOA board was held accountable in ways that went beyond just losing their positions. Criminal charges were filed against several of the board members, including Greg Thompson. The financial fraud they had committed was severe, and after a long and messy trial, the court sentenced Greg and others to significant fines and jail time. Greg had spent his life deceiving and controlling others, but now he was facing the consequences of his greed. He couldn't run, he couldn't hide. The justice system had finally caught up with him. It wasn't just about seeing him punished, it was about sending a message to anyone who thought they could get away with exploiting others. But there was also something incredibly satisfying about watching Greg Thompson's empire crumble. He had built this entire operation on falsehoods and deception, thinking he could get away with it because he was in control. But in the end, it was his own hubris that brought him down. The ripple effect and inspiration to others. What I didn't expect, though, was the ripple effect that came from this case. Word of what had happened in Willow Creek Estates spread like wildfire, and soon I was receiving calls from homeowners across the state, no, across the country, who had been dealing with corrupt HOAs. People who had been taken advantage of by their HOAs for years reached out, asking for advice, support, and guidance. They were empowered by the story of how one person, with the right knowledge and the right team behind them, could take down a corrupt system. I began working with several advocacy groups that fought for homeowners' rights. Together, we pushed for better oversight of HOAs and more transparency in how these organizations operated. We campaigned for laws that would protect homeowners from being exploited by HOA boards that had no accountability. My victory in Willow Creek Estates became a catalyst for change in communities across the country. As for me, I kept my head low after the dust had settled. I didn't need the spotlight. I had won back my land, destroyed an oppressive system, and helped a community reclaim their freedom. But in the quiet moments, when I drove through the streets of Willow Creek Estates, now full of happy, thriving homes, I couldn't help but smile. I had taken back what was mine, and in doing so, I had shown that no one, not even an HOA, could just take what didn't belong to them. It wasn't just a victory for me. It was a victory for everyone who had been told they didn't matter, for every homeowner who had been taken advantage of, for every person who had ever been bullied by a powerful organization. It was the victory of a David versus Goliath story that proved the system could be beaten, no matter how entrenched it seemed. And with that final win, the community of Willow Creek Estates finally thrived in the peace and justice it had always deserved.